The most devastating move in this story is not an argument, not a lawsuit filed in dramatic fashion, not even a confrontation in a crowded room. It is one word, two letters, delivered in a flat, professional tone to a bank officer on a Thursday afternoon. When you understand what a single no can do to a woman who used her sister's identity to fabricate financial credibility, the architecture of consequence becomes almost mathematical. Historical manhwa. The coffee was wrong. That was the first thing Elaine Park noticed when she sat down at her desk that morning. She had ground the beans herself, a small ritual that anchored her to the 15 minutes before the rest of the world made its demands on her time, but something in the proportions had shifted. The brew was too bitter, thin in a way that coated the back of the throat with something closer to regret than caffeine. She set the cup down beside her keyboard and stared at the pale brown ring it left on the white ceramic coaster, then picked it up and drank the rest of it anyway. She had learned, a long time ago, not to throw out something just because it disappointed her. Her apartment was on the 14th floor of a building in a neighborhood that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Below her window, there's a Vietnamese restaurant was opening its kitchen doors, and the smell of pho broth rising through the morning air made the coffee taste worse by comparison. She had lived here for 3 years. The building had no doorman, the elevator shuddered slightly between the 7th and 8th floor, and the intercom buzzed with a half-second delay that made every visitor sound like they were shouting from underwater. The rent was manageable. The light in the morning came in from the east and landed directly on her work desk in a clean, uncompromised beam, and that was the only amenity that had ever mattered to her. She opened her laptop. She was a senior associate at a forensic accounting firm called Larkin Voss Partners. Although the Voss in the name had retired 4 years ago, and the remaining partners had kept it out of inertia rather than sentiment. Her job, reduced to its simplest form, was to find money that someone had tried to hide. Corporations cooked books, business partners skimmed, family members raided trusts. Elaine Park found the discrepancies, documented them with the precision of a surgeon, and handed the evidence to lawyers who were paid considerably more than she was to deliver it to the appropriate authorities. She was good at this. She had the kind of mind that looked at a column of numbers the way a musician looks at a page of notation, seeing not just the individual marks, but the spaces between them, the rhythm of what was supposed to be there and wasn't. At 7:14 in the morning, her work phone rang, not the cell phone, which was still charging on the nightstand where she'd left it before her shower. Her work phone, the landline she maintained for clients and banking institutions, and the occasional IRS liaison, a number she gave out with deliberate selectivity. The caller ID read, First Continental Bank Loan Verification Division. She set her coffee down, looked at the number for the full length of the second ring. She was not expecting a call from First Continental Bank. She did not have an account at First Continental Bank. She let it ring a third time. Not out of uncertainty, but because she had learned, over the course of her professional life, that the first thing you did before engaging with any financial inquiry was to take 3 seconds to ensure you were fully present, not distracted, not warm from the shower, and already mentally elsewhere. Oh, present. She picked up on the fourth ring. Elaine Park? Good morning, Ms. Park. This is Raymond Chu. I'm calling from the Loan Verification Division at First Continental Bank. I hope I'm not catching you too early. We have a verification request on file, and I wanted to confirm some income documentation that we received as part of a loan application. Is now a good time? She noted 3 things simultaneously. The first was that Raymond Chu had a practiced rhythm to his speech, the kind that came from making these calls all day, every day, and had worn the urgency out of it without removing the procedural politeness. The second was that he had said verification request rather than your loan application, which meant she was not the applicant. She was a reference. The third was that she felt, with absolute clarity, that this call was not an administrative coincidence. I can give you a few minutes, she said. What documentation is this in reference to? We received copies of tax returns bearing your name and social security number as co-documentation for a loan application submitted by a Diana Kwan. We have her listed as your sister. According to the application, your income was being included as a household asset to support the loan qualification. I'm calling to verify the accuracy of the income figures listed and to confirm your participation in this application. Diana Kwan was her sister's married name. Diana Park, before she married Marcus Kwan 4 years ago at a ceremony that had cost more than Elaine's annual salary and had been photographed by a man who exclusively shot runway editorials in Milan. Diana Kwan. Oh, who now lived in a house in Westlake with heated floors and a kitchen that had been featured in a regional lifestyle magazine, not because the kitchen was extraordinary, but because Diana had called in a favor with someone who owed her one. Elaine said, "What income figures are listed?" Raymond Chu cleared his throat slightly. The documentation shows an annual gross income of $312,000 for the current tax year and $288,000 for the prior year. She had made in the prior tax year $94,000 gross. In the current year, her salary had been adjusted to $103,000 with a performance bonus that had brought it to $119,000. She was not wealthy. Also, she was comfortable in the way that careful people with marketable skills become comfortable, which meant she had savings, no credit card debt, a car that was 7 years old and maintained without issue, and the ability to eat at a restaurant with a proper wine list without checking her balance first. She was not, in any conceivable interpretation of her financial life, a woman who earned $312,000 a year. "Mr. Chu," she said, "can you tell me what the application is for? What is the loan purpose?" I can share that it's a commercial loan application, a business line of credit specifically, for an amount in the range of $450,000. She looked at the white ring her coffee cup had made on the coaster. Oh, she thought about the number her sister had put on those fabricated tax documents. She thought about the specific calculation required to arrive at $312,000, which was not a round number, not an obvious inflation, but something precise enough to suggest that someone had thought about what figure would be credible while still being sufficient to qualify for the credit line. Diana had not just lied, she had crafted a lie with internal logic. She had understood that a number too high would trigger scrutiny, and so she had chosen a number that was elevated enough to serve her purpose, but not so elevated as to appear fabricated. Diana had always been like this. This was not new information. The shape of the betrayal was familiar, only the scale had changed. "Mr. Chu," Elaine said, and she kept her voice completely level, the way she kept her voice when she was about to tell a client that their CFO had been stealing from them for 6 years. "I did not participate in this application. I was not consulted, I did not provide any documentation, and the income figures you have on file do not represent my actual income. I cannot verify them because they are not accurate." A pause on Raymond Chu's end, the kind of pause that meant he was writing something down. "Ms. Park, I want to be certain I understand. Are you saying that you did not authorize the use of your financial documentation in this application?" "I am saying exactly that. And the income figures listed are not correct." Another pause. Longer this time. "Ms. Park, I want to make sure I'm documenting this accurately for our compliance team. You are actively disputing the income figures shown in the documentation submitted under your name and social security number?" "Yes." "And you did not provide these documents to the applicant for use in this loan?" "I did not." The pause this time was different. It had a quality to it that she recognized from years of working on fraud cases. The particular silence of a professional who has just realized that what they thought was a routine verification call is not routine at all. "Ms. Park, I'm going to need to escalate this to our compliance and fraud review department. I'll need to document this conversation, and you may receive a follow-up call from our fraud team. Would you be willing to cooperate with any follow-up inquiry?" "Of course," she said. "I'd be glad to." She hung up the phone. She sat very still for a moment. Outside, the Vietnamese restaurant had opened its front shutter, and she could hear the faint scrape of a metal chair being dragged across a tiled floor. The coffee ring on her coaster had dried to a faint amber oval. She looked at it and thought about Diana and about the specific architectural patience that was required to do what she was about to do. Because she was not going to call Diana. She was not going to send a text message. She was not going to involve their mother, who would cry, or their aunt, who would attempt to mediate by hosting a dinner that nobody wanted to attend. She was not going to confront anyone. She was going to work. That was what she did. She found the shape of a thing, documented it completely, and then she handed it to the appropriate people and let the machinery of consequence operate without her further interference. She opened a new document on her laptop. At the top, she typed the date. Below it, she typed, First Continental Bank, Loan Verification Division, Raymond Chu. She noted the time of the call. She noted every figure he had given her. She noted the exact phrasing she had used in her responses and the exact phrasing she had used to characterize the inaccuracy of the documents. Because she had done this deliberately, had chosen the word not accurate over false and do not represent over are fraudulent, because she was not the fraud investigator here. She was the witness. And a witness who was too eager to use the language of prosecution was a witness whose credibility could be questioned. She had learned this from a case 4 years prior involving a mid-sized tech company in which the CFO's wife, who had first reported the discrepancy in the company's books, had compromised the entire civil case by calling her husband a thief in a recorded call before the forensic audit was complete. The attorney had spent 3 weeks rehabilitating her as a neutral witness. Elaine had watched this and filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that were useful. This was the part of Elaine Park's mind that most people never saw, because she was not a dramatic person. She did not express things through confrontation or volume. She expressed things through documentation, through the accumulation of specific and verifiable fact. It was through the construction of a case so complete that by the time it was presented to the relevant authority, the outcome was not a matter of argument, but of arithmetic. Diana had always underestimated this about her. Most people who shared a childhood with someone believed they knew them completely, believed that the version of a person they had witnessed growing up was the totality of that person, as though adult competence were simply an extension of childhood talent. Diana knew that Elaine was good at math. She knew Elaine worked in finance, but she had never truly understood what financial forensics meant, had never understood that Elaine spent her professional life dismantling exactly the kind of thing Diana had just done, and had done it, apparently, without a moment's hesitation. Let Elaine think about that for a moment. Let her sit with it. Diana had not hesitated. That was the thing that arrived slowly, like a bruise developing its full color hours after the impact. Diana had not called her first, had not asked, had not even offered the performance of asking and waiting for the refusal before proceeding. She had simply taken Elaine's identity, her financial history, her actual social security number, and tax documentation, and she had manufactured an income that was 3 times higher than reality, and she had submitted it to a bank as though it were a fact. As though Elaine's financial existence were a resource available to Diana whenever she needed it, like a spare room in a house whose owner had not been consulted about the arrangement. Elaine thought about this and felt something that was not anger exactly. Anger was hot and imprecise, and what she felt was colder and more specific. It was the feeling she got when she was deep in a forensic audit, and she had found not just the thing she was looking for, but the proof of the mechanism by which it was hidden, the metacrime beneath the crime, the calculated intentionality behind what someone had hoped to pass off as an error. It was the feeling of being precisely, professionally correct. She picked up her phone and called her direct supervisor at Larkin Voss, a woman named Helen Larkin, who was the original Larkin in the firm's name, and who had, over the course of a 30-year career, developed an approach to financial fraud that was equal parts legal expertise and quiet fury. "I have a situation," Elaine said when Helen picked up. "It's personal, but I want to handle it correctly." "How personal?" "Family." A beat. "Let's come in early," Helen said. "Bring whatever you have." What she had at that point was the knowledge of 1 phone call, 1 set of false figures, and a sister's married name on a commercial loan application. It was not much. But Elaine Park had built cases from considerably less, and she understood that what she was looking at was not an isolated act, but a pattern that had simply become, for the first time, visible to the systems that track these things. She thought about Diana's business. Diana Kwan Interiors, the interior design firm Diana had launched 3 years ago with money that had been, to the best of Elaine's knowledge, provided by her husband Marcus, who ran a mid-sized property development firm that had done well during the suburban expansion boom of the previous decade. Marcus was not a subtle man. He wore his wealth in the specific way of people who had earned it quickly and wanted everyone to know the timeline. He drove a car that attracted the kind of attention that required the person behind the wheel to accept that attention as their daily environment. He had opinions about restaurants that he delivered with the authority of someone who had been mistaken for a food critic and had decided not to correct the impression. But Marcus had been, by every visible indicator, quiet lately. Elaine had seen them both at their mother's birthday dinner 6 weeks ago. And Marcus had not held forth about restaurants, or his latest project, or the wine. He had drunk 2 glasses of something she didn't recognize and looked at his phone at a frequency that suggested distraction rather than interest. Diana had laughed too often and too quickly at things that were mildly funny, the laugh of someone performing ease for an audience they were worried might stop believing in it. Elaine had noticed this and had filed it, without drama, in the part of her mind designated for family data. She had not commented on it. She had not asked Diana if everything was all right, because Diana and Elaine did not have that kind of relationship, and both of them had learned years ago to stop pretending otherwise. Their relationship was cordial, consistent, and almost entirely architectural. They attended the family events that required attendance. They texted on birthdays, briefly. They had not had a genuine conversation. Just the kind where both parties said things they actually meant, and neither of them performed a version of themselves they thought the other wanted to see, since they were in their mid-20s, before Diana had married Marcus, and their orbits had achieved their final separations. There was no hostility in this. There was simply the settled reality of 2 people who did not particularly like each other and had long since stopped pretending the relationship was something other than what it was. Or so Elaine had believed. She saw now that this was not entirely accurate. Diana, it turned out, did not view their relationship as settled. Diana viewed it as a resource. Elaine drove to the office. She took the long route, the one that passed through the warehouse district where she had lived during her first year after graduate school, before she had landed the associate position at Larkin Voss. She did this sometimes when she needed to think clearly, needed the visual of the place that had preceded her competence, the reminder that she had built what she had built from a very specific starting point. The buildings were still there, most of them. One had been converted to luxury apartments with a boutique coffee shop on the ground floor. The one she had lived in was unchanged, the iron fire escape still pulled slightly away from the brick on the 3rd floor, the window on the 2nd level still covered with a piece of cardboard she was nearly certain had been there when she moved in. She had paid her own way through graduate school. She had carried the loans for 9 years before she paid them off. Then she had done this without ever once asking her parents for money she had not earned, and without ever, not for a single month, being late on a payment. This was not a moral accomplishment. It was simply a fact about her. She had done this, and she had not spoken about it, not to her mother, not to Diana, not to anyone, because the expectation that she should be congratulated for paying her own debts was the kind of expectation she found faintly embarrassing in other people and had worked deliberately to excise from herself. Diana had done something different. Diana had taken the path of alliance, the marriage that solved the problem of resource acquisition before the problem became urgent. Elaine did not judge this. She understood it as a strategy, a coherent one with its own internal logic. What she did judge, what she found herself unable to receive as anything other than a calculated act of contempt, was the assumption that Elaine's financial identity was available for annexation simply because Elaine had been careful and quiet and competent, and had therefore accumulated a clean credit history and verifiable income documentation that Diana now apparently needed and had decided to simply take. At the office, Helen was already at her desk with 2 cups of real coffee in actual ceramic mugs, which meant she had used the French press she kept in the filing cabinet behind her chair, and not the communal machine in the break room that produced something the younger associates called hot regret. Helen was 61. She had the kind of authority that did not announce itself, the authority of someone who had been right, professionally, about enough things that being right had simply become their atmospheric condition. Elaine laid out what she had: the call from Raymond Chu, the figures, the loan application, Diana's business, her own actual income figures for comparison. Helen listened without interrupting. This was a thing about Helen that Elaine had come to value above almost anything else in a professional relationship. She did not interrupt. She received information completely before she responded to it. When Elaine finished, Helen was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "Your first question should be, is this a one-time incident or a pattern?" "Yes." How much access did she have to your documents? Elaine thought. There had been one occasion, approximately 2 years ago, when their mother had needed help with a property tax dispute. And both Elaine and Diana had been enlisted to provide income documentation to a real estate attorney as part of establishing a family trust. The attorney had requested the previous 2 years of tax returns from all adult family members. Elaine had sent her documents directly to the attorney, but she had been at their mother's house when the paperwork was assembled, and the documents had been spread across the dining room table for a period of approximately 40 minutes while the attorney reviewed them in person. Diana had been there. She was present when my documents were out, Elaine said. 2 years ago. She would have had my social security number, my income figures, my filing status. She would have seen the template. Helen nodded. The question is whether she fabricated from memory or whether she obtained copies somehow. If she fabricated from scratch, the documents are clumsy, Elaine said. If she obtained my actual returns and altered them, the formatting is cleaner. The bank would have received something that looks, to a non-specialist, like a legitimate document, which would tell you something about premeditation. Yes. Helen picked up her coffee. You need to file a report with the IRS Identity Theft Division. Today. Not because it's required right now, but because you want a timestamp. You want documentation that you identified this before the bank's fraud investigation has a chance to develop its own narrative about what you knew and when. Elaine had already thought of this. She said, I also want to pull my credit report, all 3 bureaus. And if this was a commercial loan for her business, she would have needed to demonstrate that I had not only income but financial stability. She may have pulled my credit, which would show up as an inquiry you didn't authorize. Exactly. If she pulled your credit without your consent, that's a separate federal violation. Fair Credit Reporting Act. Yes. And the false tax documents are a federal crime under U.S. Code, Title 18, Section 1001, False Statements to Financial Institutions. Helen set her mug down. She looked at Elaine with the specific expression of a professional who respected another professional's preparedness. What do you want to happen? This was the question. This was always the question in any fraud case. The technical capacity to document and prosecute was one thing. The purpose it served was another. Elaine had seen cases where the client wanted restitution, cases where they wanted prosecution, cases where they wanted beneath the procedural language something that was purely punitive, wanted to watch the person who had wronged them experience the weight of consequence in the most public and permanent form available. She had learned not to judge any of these desires. She had also learned to be clear-eyed about which one she was operating from because the strategy shifted depending on the answer. I want her loan denied, she said. I want a fraud flag on the application. I want my name and social security number removed from any documentation she has filed or could file in the future. And I want a complete picture of what she did and how, so that if there is a pattern here, there is a record. Not prosecution? Elaine looked at the wall behind Helen's doll, where there was a framed copy of a Wall Street Journal article from 2009, the year Helen had served as the lead forensic accountant in a corporate fraud case that had resulted in the recovery of $63 million. Helen had framed it not because it was the biggest case of her career, but because it was the cleanest one, the one where every number had been traceable and the documentation had been, in Helen's words, the kind of complete that makes a prosecutor's closing argument write itself. Not yet, Elaine said. Not yet was a different thing from no. She spent the next 4 days building the file. This was the part of forensic work that looked, from the outside, like nothing. The part where the person at the desk was simply staring at a screen or making calls or typing. The part that contained in its apparent stillness the entire load-bearing structure of what would come later. On the first day, she filed the IRS Identity Theft Affidavit, Form 14039, and retained the submission confirmation number. She called the IRS Identity Protection Specialized Unit directly, not because the online filing was insufficient, but because she wanted a human name attached to her case. And she obtained the name of the intake agent, a man named Gerald Torres, and noted his direct extension. She then filed disputes with all 3 credit bureaus, Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian, requesting copies of her full credit reports and flagging any unauthorized inquiries within the previous 24 months. On the second day, the credit reports arrived. On Equifax, there was a hard inquiry from First Continental Bank dated 11 days prior, tied to the pre-application credit check that preceded the loan submission. This was the inquiry Diana had either initiated with Elaine's information or had caused to be initiated by submitting it as part of the application. Either way, it was an inquiry Elaine had not authorized, which was a violation of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, specifically Section 604, which outlined the permissible purposes for which a credit report could be accessed. On TransUnion, there was a second hard inquiry she had not recognized at first glance. A soft pull converted to hard inquiry from an entity called Quan Property Holdings, LLC, dated 8 months ago. The name Quan was not a coincidence. She looked at this inquiry for a long time. Then she pulled the business registration for Quan Property Holdings, LLC, from the Secretary of State's business database. It was a limited liability company registered in the state, with Marcus Quan listed as the registered agent and Diana Quan listed as a co-member. The business had been formed 18 months ago. It was not Marcus's development company, which was an entirely separate entity with a different registered agent. This was a new company, smaller, and formed during a period that roughly corresponded with the beginning of Marcus's apparent distraction and Diana's performative ease. She sat with this for a moment. Financial forensics operated on a principle she thought of as document first, theorize second. The documents were showing her something, but she was not yet in a position to know what. She documented what she had found and added it to the file. On the third day, Raymond Chu from First Continental Bank called back. He had been escalated, as he'd promised, to the fraud review team, and he was calling to confirm that her statement had been forwarded and that the bank was conducting an internal review of the application. He did not tell her what the outcome of that review was likely to be, because he was not authorized to, but he told her that a member of the fraud team would be in contact with her within 10 business days, and that in the meantime, no action was being taken on the application. She thanked him professionally and noted the time and content of the call in her file. On the fourth day, Diana called. It was a Sunday. Elaine was in her kitchen making a proper breakfast. The kind she only made on days when she had the time, eggs in brown butter with capers, and a piece of toast that required actual attention to get right. The smell of the butter browning was something she found almost unconditionally comforting, a small sensory anchor in a week that had been more agitated beneath the surface than she generally permitted her weeks to be. She looked at Diana's name on the screen of her cell phone and finished the eggs before she picked up. Elaine? Diana's voice had its public register active, the voice she used when she wanted something and did not want to appear to want it. A voice that began with warmth and carried, beneath the warmth, a specific kind of pressure. I've been trying to reach you. She had not been trying to reach her. There had been no missed calls, no texts, nothing in the 4 days since the bank call that suggested Diana had any awareness of what Elaine had done, which meant this call was about something else, or was the beginning of something Diana thought was a casual check-in that she was going to steer gradually toward the topic. I've been busy, Elaine said. Of course. A pause. How are you? It feels like forever. We should do dinner. Elaine ate a forkful of egg. The capers were slightly too salty, which was her fault for not rinsing them. I'm well, she said. How are things with you and Marcus? A half-beat pause. Just a half-beat. Someone less accustomed to listening would have missed it. Good, things are good. Marcus is deep in this new project. You know how he gets. A small laugh. How's the business? Diana Quan Interiors? It's been incredible. I have 3 projects running right now. There's a new development in the north side that brought me in for the model units, which is great visibility. Elaine thought about the commercial loan application, a $450,000 business line of credit for interior design materials and operational expenses, presumably, or for something else. That's great, Elaine said. I'm actually trying to scale a bit. Diana continued, and here it was, the pivot, performed with enough setup that it would have been imperceptible to most people. There's an opportunity to take on more of these development projects, but it would require some capital. You know how it is in the design space. You front the material costs and the clients pay at completion. Cash flow management. Elaine took a sip of her coffee. I know how it works. Oh yes, I'm actually working through some financing options right now. Nothing major, just making sure the business has the runway it needs. Another pause. I was thinking I might ask you about it, actually. Not for money, just to talk through the structure. You're so much better at this stuff than I am. This was the approach then. Not confrontation, not confession. Diana was going to attempt to loop Elaine into a conversation about business financing in a way that would, eventually, position Elaine as a participant in whatever narrative Diana had constructed. A willing advisor, someone who had been consulted and informed, which was not the same as someone who had not known and had not consented, which was the accurate version. Elaine said, "I'm pretty busy this month, Diana. Wait, but send me an email with the specifics and I'll take a look when I have bandwidth." "Oh, it's not that formal. I just want to—" "Email is better," Elaine said. "Then I can give it proper attention." She heard Diana adjust, a microscopic recalibration. "Sure, I'll send something over. It's not urgent." "All right, say hi to Marcus." "I will. And Elaine, we should really do dinner, properly catch up." "Sure," Elaine said. "We'll figure out a date." She hung up. She wrote a summary of the call into her file. The date, the time, the content, the strategic maneuvering she had identified, and the specific phrasing Diana had used. Nothing major, financing options, consult you about the structure. She noted that Diana had not mentioned the bank, had not mentioned the loan application, had not mentioned Elaine's name on any documents. Oh, she noted the implication. Either Diana did not yet know that the bank had contacted Elaine, or she knew and was attempting to preemptively establish a narrative in which Elaine was a knowing participant. She set her fork down and finished her coffee standing at the kitchen window, looking at the city below, which was, at this hour on a Sunday, engaged in its particular version of quiet. She thought about the word escalation and what it meant in a forensic context. And she thought about the specific patience required to do this correctly. She was not Diana. She did not need the outcome to happen quickly. She needed it to happen correctly. In the following week, she requested a formal consultation with an attorney at a firm that specialized in banking fraud and financial crimes. She had a professional relationship with this firm through Larkin Voss, and she was seen quickly by a partner named Adriana Cruz, who had a small plant on her desk that was dying quietly in an east-facing window, and who asked questions with the kind of directness that signaled she had not time for any answer longer than what the question required. Elaine laid out the situation. Adriana Cruz listened, asked 4 questions, and then said, "The bank's fraud investigation is the primary mechanism here. When they flag the application, they file a suspicious activity report with FinCEN. That becomes a federal record. Your IRS affidavit cross-references it with the tax documentation. At that point, what you have is a documented incident of bank fraud under federal statute. Although the question of whether the federal government pursues prosecution is theirs, not yours. Your role is to ensure the documentation is complete, and your position as the victim, not a participant, is unambiguous. And the credit inquiry under the FCRA violation? File a complaint with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. You can do this online. Keep the documentation. It's a separate actionable issue from the fraud, but it reinforces the pattern." What about Quan Property Holdings? Elaine had brought the business registration documents and the TransUnion inquiry. "The company used my credit information 8 months ago. That's a separate inquiry." Adriana Cruz looked at the documents. She was quiet for a moment. "This is Marcus Quan's company?" "And Diana's. Well, she's listed as co-member." "So the credit pull 8 months ago was under a company they own jointly." She tapped the document with one finger. "If they submitted your information as a guarantor for any credit instrument under this company without your consent, that's the same violation as the bank application, different vehicle. Pull the business credit applications for Quan Property Holdings if you can get them." "How would I obtain those?" "If there's an active loan or line of credit with any institutional lender under this company, and if your information was submitted as supporting documentation, the FCRA entitles you to notification. You can also request, through your attorney of record, a subpoena for those records if this escalates to litigation." Elaine made a note. Nayo, what's the practical timeline on the bank's fraud investigation?" 30 to 60 days for internal resolution. They'll suspend or deny the loan application almost certainly, given what you've told them." The question is whether they decide to pursue the matter with federal authorities or handle it as an internal credit decision. Banks generally prefer the latter unless the amount is significant enough to justify the administrative burden of a formal referral. $450,000. Adriana Cruz raised her eyebrows slightly. That's significant enough. Elaine left the meeting with 3 action items. First, file the CFPB complaint regarding the unauthorized credit inquiry. Second, retain Adriana Cruz's firm formally with a letter of engagement so that all subsequent communication with financial institutions and federal agencies was channeled through legal representation. Third, request a business credit profile on Kwan Property Holdings to determine whether her information had been submitted to additional lenders. She had not yet told anyone in her family what she had done. Her mother called every Sunday, and Elaine had answered those calls with her normal, attentive brevity, asking about her mother's health and her neighbor's garden and the book she was reading without volunteering anything about the week that had just passed. Her mother was not a woman who engaged with complexity gracefully. She processed the world through the lens of family harmony, which meant that any information Elaine provided about Diana would be received not as facts about a specific incident, but as a threat to a general peace she had been maintaining through careful effort for decades. Elaine had no intention of threatening that peace. She simply had no intention of protecting it either. On the 14th day after the bank call, she received a formal letter from First Continental Bank's Fraud and Compliance Department. It was addressed to her as the third-party identity holder referenced in the application. It informed her that the application in question had been placed under review following her verbal report, that the review had identified inconsistencies in the submitted documentation, and that the bank had suspended processing pending the outcome of their internal investigation. And it further stated that her identity information had been flagged in their system, and that any future applications referencing her documentation would be subject to direct verification contact. It invited her to submit any additional supporting information through their fraud liaison office. She had her attorney send a formal response that same afternoon, including copies of the IRS identity theft affidavit submission confirmation, the CFPB complaint number, and a concise summary of the unauthorized credit inquiry on her TransUnion report. The letter was professional, precise, and completely devoid of emotional language. It was the kind of letter that, when received by a bank's legal department, caused someone to sit up a little straighter in their chair and begin a different kind of review than they had been conducting. But on the 17th day, Diana sent the email Elaine had requested during their Sunday phone call. It was 3 paragraphs long and written with the careful casualness of someone who had composed and revised it multiple times before sending. It described, in general terms, Diana Kwan Interior's business model and cash flow requirements. It mentioned, in the second paragraph, that Diana was in the process of securing a business line of credit to allow the firm to take on larger projects without the capital constraints of self-financing. It then, in the third paragraph, expressed that Diana had been working with some financial consultants and had put together a package for the bank, and that she wanted to loop in Elaine, given her expertise, to make sure everything looked right. The phrase "put together a package" was noted. And the phrase "make sure everything looked right" was noted with particular attention. Elaine read this paragraph 3 times. Then she forwarded the email to Adriana Cruz with a single line, "For the file." She did not respond to Diana's email. 2 days later, Diana called again. This time, Elaine did not wait until she finished making breakfast. She picked up on the second ring. "I sent you an email," Diana said. "I saw it. I haven't heard back. I've been meaning to get to it." A short pause. Something shifted in Diana's register. Not fear, not yet, but the specific recalibration of someone whose strategy is not producing the expected response, and who is uncertain whether to accelerate or withdraw. "Elaine, I just want to talk through the business financing. It's not a big deal. I just need a second opinion." "Diana, I need to ask you something directly." Silence. "Did you submit my tax returns to First Continental Bank as supporting documentation for your loan application?" The silence had a texture now. It was not the silence of surprise, but of a person deciding, in real time, which path was available to them and what each path cost. Elaine counted silently. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 seconds of silence was, in her experience, the interval between genuine surprise and calculated response. "I don't know what you're talking about," Diana said. Her voice had the specific flatness of someone who had rehearsed the denial before the question arrived, which meant the question had not been a surprise. "The bank called me," Elaine said. "Loan verification. They read me the income figures attached to your application. 312,000 for this year, 288 for last year." Another silence. "Those are not my income figures, Diana." Diana started, and then stopped. Started again. "Look, I was going to tell you. I just needed to. I'm trying to build something, Elaine. Marcus and I, things have been complicated, and the business is the thing I'm building for myself. I just needed the numbers to look right enough to qualify." Look right enough? There it was. Not I was desperate, not I didn't think. I needed the numbers to look right enough. It was the language of craft, not crisis. The language of someone who had decided on a specific outcome and engineered the means of reaching it. "You used my social security number," Elaine said, "on federal financial documents." Diana. "Oh, I'm telling you this as a fact, not as a complaint. You used my federal tax identification on documents submitted to a financial institution. I have already informed the bank that the figures are inaccurate. I have filed an IRS identity theft affidavit. I have filed a complaint with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau regarding the unauthorized credit inquiry. I have retained an attorney." The silence this time was total. Diana's voice had dropped. "You did this already?" "Yes. Before you even talked to me." "The bank called me on a Thursday morning," Elaine said. "They asked me to verify the income. I said no. What happened after that is procedural." Elaine. And now the voice changed for the third time, and what it became was not the performance register or the calculating register, but something rawer. Something that carried in it the history of two people who had grown up in the same house and knew each other's specific weaknesses. "I would have paid it back. The loan repayment would have been mine, not yours. Your name was never going to be on anything official. I just needed it for the qualification." "That's bank fraud," Elaine said. "The intent to repay doesn't change the classification of the act." "You're really going to do this?" "Diana, I have already done it." The call ended. Diana did not hang up dramatically. She simply stopped speaking, and after a moment she said, in a voice from which most of the architecture had departed, "I have to go," and the line went quiet. Elaine stood in her kitchen for a moment. She did not feel relief. She did not feel triumph. She felt the particular, professional satisfaction of someone who had said exactly what they meant in precisely the words that were required. She picked up her phone and called Adriana Cruz and reported the substance of the call, which was now the fourth documented contact from Diana in a 17-day period, 2 phone calls and 1 email, all of which contained material relevant to the fraud case, and all of which were now time-stamped entries in a file that was becoming, day by day, the most complete documentation of Diana Kwan's behavior that anyone had ever assembled. What happened next happened in 2 parallel tracks, the way investigations always did. The first track was institutional. First Continental Bank's fraud team completed their internal review and filed a suspicious activity report, ASAR, with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, also which is the Treasury Department division that receives and analyzes financial intelligence related to potential criminal activity. This was not something that became public. Elaine did not know it had happened immediately. She learned it later from Adriana Cruz, who had contacts in the right places and who understood that the information was relevant to her client's understanding of the situation's legal terrain. A SAR filing was not an arrest, not an indictment, not a prosecution. It was a record. It was the beginning of a paper trail that resided at the federal level and that would not simply disappear because Diana preferred it didn't exist. The loan application was formally denied. The second track was familial, and it was messier in the way that all familial tracks are messier. Because they operated through channels of emotion and obligation and old story rather than through procedural clarity. Their mother called on a Thursday evening. Her mother's calls were usually on Sundays, and the variance alone told Elaine something. She answered. "Diana called me," her mother said. Her mother's voice on the phone always had a certain quality. a careful enunciation that dated from a period in her early life when she had been learning English and had overcompensated for her accent by articulating each syllable with architectural precision. It had become, over time, simply the way she spoke. But when she was upset, the precision increased, each word placed down like a weight. She said, "You've been causing problems with her bank." Elaine considered this phrasing for a moment. "Oh, Diana used my tax returns without my permission to apply for a loan," she said. "The bank called me to verify the income figures. I told them the figures were not accurate because they weren't." "Why didn't you talk to her first?" "Because the bank asked me to verify. I verified correctly." "Elaine." Her mother's voice adjusted. "You know how hard things have been for Diana lately, Marcus. Things with Marcus are not good. She's trying to build something for herself. You couldn't have helped her with this?" This was the question beneath the question. Not a factual inquiry, but a values inquiry. A question about whether Elaine's loyalty to accuracy was supposed to yield to her loyalty to family, and whether the willingness to answer that question incorrectly was, in her mother's framework, a failure of character rather than an expression of it. Elaine said, "If Diana needed help with financing for her business, she could have asked me. I would have sat down with her and gone through the options. I would have helped her put together a legitimate application. She did not ask me. She used my identity without telling me. That's not a problem I created, it's a problem she created. You could have fixed it quietly." "No," Elaine said. "I couldn't have." "Why not?" "Because a bank officer had already asked me a direct question, and I had already answered it truthfully. Reversing that answer would have made me a participant in the fraud, not a solution to it. I'm not willing to be that." Her mother was quiet. When she spoke again, and her voice had the quality of someone who understood the argument, but found its conclusion unacceptable for reasons that had nothing to do with the argument. "She's your sister." "I know. Family doesn't do this to family." Elaine thought about this, about the specific, practiced confidence required to take someone else's social security number and sign it to a fraudulent financial document, about the absolute certainty that the sister whose information you were using would either not find out or would not act, about what it meant to be that certain about someone you had grown up alongside, to be that convinced of their passivity. "Diana did this to family," Elaine said quietly. Her mother did not respond immediately. Elaine could hear the specific silence of her mother's kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, a distant sound that might have been the television in the next room. Then her mother said, "I need you to think about what you're doing." And the call ended with the particular gentleness of someone placing a receiver down carefully rather than setting it down normally, as though the conversation had been fragile and they were managing even its conclusion with care. Elaine put her phone down. She was not angry at her mother. Her mother was operating from a worldview with its own coherence, a worldview in which the maintenance of family peace was a primary value, and the mechanism for maintaining that peace was the consistent absorption of bad behavior by the people best positioned to absorb it, meaning the people who were most stable, most capable, most professionally competent, because they could absorb it and still be fine. And while the people who were struggling could not afford the cost of accountability. It was, in its own way, a kind of tax on competence. The more capable you were, the more you were expected to subsidize the people who were less so. Elaine had been paying this tax since she was approximately 17 years old, when Diana had borrowed $200 from her first paycheck and not paid it back, and their mother had suggested gently that Elaine not make a thing of it because Diana was going through a difficult time. Diana was 19 then and going through a difficult time that lasted, with minor interruptions, approximately until she met Marcus Kwan and found a more permanent solution to the problem of resource acquisition. This was not bitterness. This was simply the history assembled from its component parts. Elaine was not interested in prosecuting the history. She was interested in the present. And in the present, Diana had used her social security number on a federal financial document, and the bank had called and Elaine had said no. And everything that followed from that single syllable was now operating through the machinery of institutional process, which did not run on family feeling and did not recognize the concept of making it quiet. 3 weeks after the bank call, the investigative track that had been running quietly through financial channels produced its next visible result. Adriana Cruz called her on a Tuesday afternoon. "I've received a subpoena notice," she said. "It's from the U.S. Attorney's Office, Northern Division. They're opening a preliminary investigation into the loan application and the associated documentation. Also, they're requesting your voluntary cooperation as the identity victim." Elaine processed this for a moment. A preliminary investigation by the U.S. Attorney meant that the SAR filing had been reviewed and someone in the federal system had decided the matter warranted resources. This was not a given. SAR filings happened constantly. Most of them were reviewed and filed without further action. The ones that progressed to investigative status had certain characteristics. They involved significant dollar amounts. They showed signs of deliberate, premeditated fabrication rather than opportunistic error. And they had clean, documented evidence of the discrepancy between the fraudulent documentation and the verifiable truth. Elaine had built exactly that documentation. "I'll cooperate fully," she said. "You tell me what they need." She met with a federal investigator named Christine Park, no relation, who had a corner office in the federal building and who asked her questions in the same flat, evaluating way that Elaine herself conducted financial interviews. Not aggressive, not friendly, simply precise. Elaine answered every question with the same precision she used in her own professional interviews. She provided copies of her actual tax returns for the years in question. She provided the time-stamped IRS affidavit filing, the CFPB complaint, the Equifax and TransUnion reports with the unauthorized inquiries highlighted, the email from Diana, and the notes from their phone conversations. Christine Park looked at the file for a moment. "You anticipated this would escalate," she said. It was not a question. "I did my job," Elaine said. "I document things correctly when they're relevant. I suspected this might become relevant." "Have you had any other contact with the applicant since the original bank call?" 2 phone calls and 1 email, all documented. She provided the notes. Christine Park made a note. Were there any statements in those contacts that you interpreted as acknowledgement of the fraudulent submission? Elaine quoted Diana's exact words from the second phone call. "I just needed the numbers to look right enough to qualify." She noted that this statement had been an implicit acknowledgement that the submitted numbers had been altered from her actual figures for the express purpose of meeting the loan qualification threshold. Christine Park wrote this down carefully. Looked up. "Ms. Park, is there anything else about the financial relationship between you and the applicant that we should know about for the purposes of this investigation?" Elaine thought about the Quan Property Holdings inquiry on her TransUnion report. She had been waiting to raise this, had wanted to wait until she had more information, but this was the moment and the audience for which the information was most relevant. "I identified a second unauthorized credit inquiry on my TransUnion report, dated 8 months prior to the bank application. The entity that pulled my credit is a limited liability company called Quan Property Holdings, of which the applicant is a co-member. I have not yet been able to determine whether my information was submitted to any lender in connection with that company, but given the pattern indicated by the bank application, I believe the inquiry warrants review." Christine Park looked at her. "Do you have the business registration documents?" "Yes." She provided them. The investigator spent several seconds reviewing the documents. Then she said, "We'll look into this." Elaine did not ask when. She did not ask what they would find. She understood that from this moment forward, the investigation was not hers to conduct or to manage. She had handed the materials to the appropriate party with the appropriate authority. That was the whole of her role, and she had done it completely. She took the elevator down from the federal building and walked to her car in the parking structure. The structure was dim, the fluorescent lighting on the second level stuttering with a periodicity that suggested the bulb was near its end. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. She thought about Diana, about the specific moment Diana had made the decision to do what she had done. She tried to locate the moment in her imagination. Diana at a desk somewhere, or perhaps at the kitchen table in the Westlake house with the heated floors, looking at the loan application, understanding that her actual financials would not support it, and then making the particular calculation that Elaine's financials would, and that Elaine was unlikely to find out, and that if she did find out, she would probably not do anything about it. That last calculation, that assessment of Elaine's likely inaction, that was the part that interested her most, not the fraud itself, which was comprehensible as an act of desperation or greed or both. But the specific confidence in Elaine's passivity, the conviction that Elaine, when confronted with a choice between family loyalty and institutional honesty, would choose the former. Diana had known her for 34 years. She had known her as the quieter sister, the one who handled things without drama, the one who did not make scenes at family dinners, the one who absorbed the small injustices of shared parentage without comment. She had extrapolated from the small injustices to the large one and decided the result would be the same. What Diana had not understood, had possibly never understood, was that there was a difference between choosing not to fight and being unable to. There was a difference between absorbing a thing because it cost less than the conflict and absorbing a thing because you lacked the capacity to respond. Elaine had always been in the first category. And the thing about a person in the first category, the person who chose not to fight because the thing wasn't worth it, was that the same calculation that kept them silent also told them, with perfect clarity, when the thing was finally worth it. She started the car. The dashboard clock read 4:17 p.m. She had a report due at Larkin Voss the following morning on a completely separate matter, a corporate account with a subsidiary that had been misreporting quarterly revenues by approximately 9%, small enough to appear like estimation error, large enough to be intentional. She needed to finish her analysis on the subsidiary's cash flow statements tonight. She pulled out of the parking structure and into the late afternoon traffic. But she did not think about Diana again for the rest of the evening. The federal investigation moved at its own speed, which was not fast. This was not a flaw in the system. It was the system doing its job with the care the job required. Elaine understood this and did not experience it as waiting. She experienced it as the background process that ran while she continued the rest of her life, the way a large file transfers in the background while you do other work on the same machine. She completed her report on the corporate client. She started a new case involving a family estate dispute in which one sibling had been managing the parents' investment accounts, and the other sibling suspected correctly that the managing sibling had been taking distributions without disclosure. She worked. She made proper breakfasts on mornings when she had time and ate whatever was fastest on mornings when she didn't. She went to dinner with a friend who worked in civil litigation and who had very strong opinions about pasta shapes and their appropriate sauces, and they argued about this companionably for 2 hours. And when Elaine walked home from the restaurant, she felt, as she often felt, after evenings with people she genuinely liked, a quiet, uncomplicated satisfaction. 6 weeks after the bank call, she received a letter from Diana's attorney. She read it once, front to back, and then called Adriana Cruz. While Diana's attorney had sent a letter requesting that Elaine cease cooperation with any federal investigation related to the loan application and reminding her that family relationships should be handled through private mediation rather than institutional channels. The letter further stated that Diana did not intend harm, and that the documentation had been assembled under the reasonable belief that Elaine's consent would be forthcoming, which was a legal construction so architecturally unstable that Adriana Cruz, when Elaine read the relevant sentence aloud, made a small sound that was the professional equivalent of a laugh. Reasonable belief that consent would be forthcoming, Adriana said. Who wrote this? The firm is listed as Galloway and Associates. Galloway's a generalist. Not criminal, not federal banking law. Oh, Diana hired someone who doesn't understand the landscape. A pause. This letter is actually helpful to you. How so? Because it acknowledges that documentation was submitted. It's arguing about intent and consent, not disputing the submission. Any document submitted to a federal investigation that acknowledges the central act while disputing only the mental state of the actor is a gift to the prosecution. Elaine forwarded the letter to Christine Park at the federal building with a brief note identifying it as received correspondence from the subject's legal representative. Things began to happen in a different register after that. The specific quality of the silence from Diana's direction changed. It was no longer the silence of someone who was managing a situation. Instead, it became the silence of someone who had been advised by counsel to say nothing, which was a different silence entirely. It had the particular texture of a house whose residents had gone quiet Not because the house was peaceful, but because something was happening inside it that required all available attention. Marcus's development company filed a quarterly disclosure that flagged a significant receivables gap, a difference between contracted revenues and actual collections. This was public record, filed with the State Business Registry, and Elaine found it while conducting a routine search on Quan Property Holdings as a background research exercise. The receivables gap was not criminal on its face. It was a business problem. But it was also, in the context of everything else, one more piece of the shape she was trying to see completely. Here's the shape was this. Marcus's business was under financial pressure. The pressure was sufficient that Diana, who was attached to this financial ecosystem through her marriage and through the jointly held LLC, had needed a $450,000 credit line for a business that from the outside appeared to be functioning adequately. The credit line was not for Diana Quan Interiors. Or rather, it was not only for Diana Quan Interiors, it was for the management of a larger financial problem that Diana was trying to solve before it became visible. She presented this analysis to Adriana Cruz, not as a conclusion, but as a documented inference. Adriana took it to Christine Park. Christine Park, it turned out, had already been looking at Marcus Quan's development company in connection with a separate inquiry that had been initiated several months before Elaine's case arrived on her desk. Elaine did not ask what that inquiry was. She provided what she had, answered what she was asked, and returned, as she always did, to the background process. On a Wednesday morning, 61 days after the initial phone call from Raymond Chu, Elaine received a call from Adriana Cruz. She was in the middle of reviewing a set of bank statements for the estate case, and she answered with her professional brevity. The U.S. Attorney's Office has issued a grand jury subpoena to First Continental Bank for all documentation related to the Quan application and to two related entities, one of which is Quan Property Holdings, Adriana said. I'm also being advised, through a contact, that Diana has been offered a proffer session, which means they have enough to charge, and they're offering her an opportunity to cooperate. A proffer session was a meeting in which a potential defendant talked to federal prosecutors about what they knew, with limited immunity from prosecution for the specific statements made in the meeting. It was offered when prosecutors already had enough to proceed, but believed the defendant had information about a larger network of activity that was more valuable than the prosecution of the individual defendant alone. Marcus, Elaine said, it was not a question. That would be my read of the situation, Adriana said. Elaine thought about Marcus at her mother's birthday dinner 6 weeks before the bank call. The 2 glasses of wine he had drunk without holding forth. The phone. What does this mean for my case? Your case, as a matter of your personal exposure, is essentially resolved. Your documentation established clearly that you were the victim of identity fraud and not a participant in the application. The federal investigation has the evidence they need. You're not under any legal threat. You may be called as a witness if this goes to trial, but that's the extent of it. She was quiet for a moment. And Diana? That depends on whether she cooperates and on what she knows. If she cooperates and what she knows is significant, she may be looking at a reduced or deferred charge. If she doesn't cooperate, the U.S. attorney proceeds with what they have, which is documented bank fraud in connection with the loan application. Minimum sentencing guidelines for bank fraud under federal statute start at a year. Though first-time offenders with no prior record can receive probation depending on the judge and the circumstances. Elaine looked at the bank statements open on her screen. The estate case had a pattern in the third quarter of the prior year in which a series of small transfers had moved money from the investment account into what appeared to be a personal account held by the managing sibling. She had been about to note the specific dates when the call came in. The pattern was still there, still waiting to be documented, indifferent to whatever was happening in her private life. "Thank you, Adriana," she said. "One more thing. The unauthorized credit inquiries on your TransUnion and Equifax reports. I filed for correction on your behalf with both bureaus. The corrections have been processed. Your credit report is clean." "Good." She hung up. She returned to the bank statements. Their mother called that evening, not on Sunday. On a Wednesday, the same day the proffer session news had arrived, which meant that Diana had called her after speaking with her own attorney, which meant that Diana was scared. "Elaine?" Her mother's voice was the careful enunciation voice, but underneath the precision, there was something else now. A frequency that Elaine associated with the specific distress of a person who has been maintaining a story about the world and is watching the story become untenable. Diana says there is a federal investigation. Yes. Is that because of you? Elaine considered how to answer this accurately. I reported what I knew to the appropriate authorities, she said. I was legally required to cooperate with the bank's inquiry. Everything that followed from that cooperation was the result of what the investigation found. She says you could stop it, that if you withdrew your cooperation. I can't withdraw what I've already provided. The documentation exists. It's been submitted to federal authorities. It's no longer in my possession to withdraw. Her mother was quiet. The kitchen hum, the distant television. She has children, her mother said. Diana had 2 daughters, 7 and 9 years old. Elaine knew their names and their ages and had given them birthday presents, chosen by a personal shopper she used for exactly this kind of obligation. She did not know them as people. She had never been invited to know them as people. I know, Elaine said. Oh, and Marcus? They're saying Marcus... I don't know what they're saying about Marcus, Mom. I know what I know about what happened to me. You knew it would come to this. This landed differently from the other things her mother had said. Elaine sat with it for a moment. Did she know it would come to this? She had known, from the moment Raymond Chu read her the income figures, that she was looking at something that extended beyond the single loan application. She had known, from her professional experience, that fabricated financial documentation was rarely a first act, was almost always part of a larger pattern of financial management that had been built incrementally and that would, when exposed, collapse in stages rather than all at once. She had known this the way she knew any financial structure, by its proportions, by what the numbers implied beyond their face value. I knew what I found, she said. I did my job. She's your sister. She committed federal bank fraud using my identity, Elaine said. That fact doesn't change because we share parents. Her mother's breath on the line. Then quietly, I know. It was the most honest thing her mother had said to her in this conversation, and possibly in many conversations before it. The smallest acknowledgement, and perhaps the only one she was capable of, but there it was. I know that this is not your fault. I know Diana did this. I know you are the person who has always absorbed the cost of other people's choices, and I am asking you to do it one more time. And I know in saying so that I am asking for something I have no right to ask for. Elaine felt for the first time since the bank call, something that was close to sadness. Not grief, not regret. Something smaller and more precise. A sadness for the version of her family that had existed before Diana's calculation, the version that had been inadequate and imperfect and insufficient in all the ways that families are insufficient, but had been, until this moment, at least operating in the same general direction. That version was not recoverable. It had been made unrecoverable by Diana's decision to treat Elaine's financial identity as a tool, and the outcome of that decision was not something Elaine had chosen. It was something Diana had chosen, and it had landed where it landed, and the people who were sad about where it had landed were sad in the end about a thing Diana had done. I'll talk to you Sunday, Elaine said. She went to sleep at 10:30. She slept without difficulty. 3 months after the initial bank call, Diana accepted a proffer arrangement with the U.S. Attorney's Office. What she provided in that session was, as far as Elaine ever officially knew, information about Marcus Kwan's property development company and a set of transactions that had been conducted through Kwan Property Holdings, in which real estate assets had been used as collateral for a series of loans, the proceeds of which had been directed to entities with no apparent business purpose. This was the kind of financial architecture that forensic accountants had a specific and unflattering name for. A parking structure. A system for moving money to places where it would not be associated with the source of funds. Marcus Kwan was indicted 4 months later on 6 counts of bank fraud and 2 counts of money laundering. Diana Kwan was charged with 1 count of bank fraud related to the First Continental application. She received a sentence of 18 months probation and a fine, given her cooperation with the larger investigation and the absence of prior criminal history. The fine was commensurate with the amount of the loan she had attempted to obtain. Elaine read the sentencing summary when Adriana Cruz emailed it to her. She printed it, added it to the file she had built, and filed the file in the cabinet behind her desk where she kept closed cases. She did not feel satisfaction in the way that satisfaction is usually described, the warmth of it, the release. She felt the specific, a professional completion of a thing that had been started and was now finished. The same thing she felt at the end of any forensic engagement in which the documentation had been correct and the outcome had been appropriate. She opened a new case file. At Larkin Voss, 2 weeks after the sentencing, Helen called her into the office and offered her a senior partner track. The firm had been considering it for some time, Helen said, but the completeness and precision with which Elaine had managed the personal case alongside her professional responsibilities had clarified the matter. Elaine accepted. She called her mother that evening. Her mother answered on the second ring. They talked for 12 minutes about her mother's garden, which was producing an unexpected abundance of zucchini, and then about a book her mother was reading about the history of salt, and about the weather, which had been unusually warm. They did not talk about Diana. They did not talk about Marcus. They did not talk about what had happened or what it meant or whether anything would be different now. They talked about zucchini and salt and weather, which were the things available to them. And when the call ended, it ended as it usually did, with her mother saying, "Talk soon," and Elaine saying, "Yes, Sunday," and the line going quiet. She set her phone down on the desk next to her laptop, which was open to the new case file. The file was empty except for the header. A client name, a case number, a date, the beginning of a record that would, in time, become complete. She picked up her pen, she began to write.